sort of sits in the middle, and it guides and it advises and it regulates a little bit, but it still lets the forces of free markets operate. And I have argued at great length that these kind of four conditions held increasingly in Europe between 1450 and 1750, the sort of 3 centuries leading up to the Industrial Revolution. And that is the kind of environment that led increasingly to incredibly creative, innovative people. And here's a list of them: Spinoza and Hume, James Watt and Adam Smith, Lavoisier and Euler, Alessandro Volta, Ludwig van Beethoven. I mean, these are all people who came up with brand new ideas in an environment that supported them, if not perfectly, at least far better than anything in the past. So then the question is, do these conditions hold today? And I would put it this way: the incentives in propositional knowledge, in science, are still there, and they're stronger and larger and more pervasive than ever. The market for ideas today provides unprecedented rewards and incentives to successful intellectual innovators, particularly in science. So what we do is we have hundreds of thousands of people who work in intellectual endeavors, most of them, but not all, in universities. And so what do we offer them? We offer them what most of these people need more than anything else, which is financial security, which is tenure. And of course, in research institutions, you get things like named chairs. Then we have rewards. And of course, there's a whole pyramid of rewards, at which the Nobel Prize and the Abel Prize presumably stand at the very peak. But there are many, many other rewards: membership in academies and prizes for the best paper in this and the best book in that, honorary degrees. And the funny thing is, these incentives are cheap relative to the benefits that these people bestow on mankind. And that is, I think, a critical thing. Now, of course, in addition to that, for people who care about this, there's name recognition, there's fame through mass media, both print and electronic, and perhaps most important, of course, these things lead to peer recognition, which is what many of academics really want. They want to be respected by their peers, by other people like themselves. And of course, in addition, for a very few, there's lots of money to be made if they work in the right field and hit it right. Now, some of these incentives are already noticeable in about 1500. But in some ways, the 20th century has done far better than anybody before. So, the Copley Medal in England for engineering was established in 1738. In 1799, Count Rumford established the Rumford Medal. And the first winner of the Rumford Medal was Count Rumford. Clever. But so it goes. But most of these things were still puny until about 1900. And then you get the Nobels in 1901, the Fields Medal in Mathematics in 1936, and on and on and on. So we reward scientists today. And yet, there are sources of concern. One of them is what I call the dynamics of institutional adaptation. So when technology changes, institutions have to adapt in various ways. And the problem is that institutions are usually slow to adapt. It takes decades and decades until various parliamentary committees and political forces agree that some form of regulation or some form of control is necessary. And what evolutionary theory suggests is that adaptation to a changing environment is quite possible, provided that the changes in the technological environment are not too fast and not too abrupt. But a sudden, discontinuous shock will lead to mass extinctions and catastrophes. And we know this is true, of course, from evolutionary history. And so there's some concern that the acceleration in the rate of technological change in recent decades cannot be matched by institutional adaptation. And what's more, the acceleration in the rate of acceleration, which is implied by the last 10 years' advances, in AI and similar fields. So, you can sort of think about where this is going to be a problem. A certain technological invention have led to political polarization through social media, for instance. This is something we haven't fully solved, and it's not clear that we will be able to. Now, is the world sufficiently fragmented? So fragmentation has always been, in many ways, a force for the good, in the sense that nations were competing with each other, and therefore nobody could feel left behind. And that, it was true for Europe in the 17th and 18th century, and it's still true for the world. The problem, I think, is that fragmentation is also correlated with nationalism, and that the likelihood of war is, of course, higher the more fragmented the polity is. And so here is an interesting factoid. Between 1500 and 2000 in Europe, there were only 60 to 70 years out of 500 in which there wasn't one major conflict in Europe. And of course, the fragmented world today still, sad to say, is not at peace. And of course, that is closely associated with economic nationalism, which gives us sanctions, it gives us tariffs, it gives us non-tariff barriers, and various sort of unwarranted support for strategic industries. And those things are costly, they're inefficient, and they slow down progress seriously. And then, of course, there's populism. So, I'm not going to have time here to talk about populism. There are probably people in the room who know a great deal more about it than I do. But as I see it, what populism really is an anti-intellectual, anti-elitist movement. And that's problematic because, as I said earlier, most progress is achieved by people in the very upper tail of the human capital distribution, who are in many ways an intellectual elite. They may be university professors, they may be top scientists, but they are members of an elite. If society turns against those elites, you can see trouble on the horizon. And we have to now, that's particularly associated with autocracies and people like Putin, Orban, and similar. And then, of course, we are being threatened by something which I would call xenophobia. Much progress has been achieved, particularly in the US, by engineers, scientists, people who came from many other countries. And the three winners of the Nobel Prize this year, all of them were born outside the United States and did most of their work in the United States. And that is quite typical. And so there are then failures in the market for ideas. Misinformation, disinformation proliferate. Many of them may lead to sort of crazy ideas that become more and more popular thanks to social media. And there's a serious threat to the mobility of upper tail human capital today, due to policies, and not just in the United States, but almost everywhere, that are known as anti-immigration policies, which are a source of great concern. So, in conclusion then, I don't think there is place for unbridled optimism the way I felt about, say, 2 decades ago. I read the papers too, and the future of Western industrialized countries is, I think, placed in the balance. And as Sigmund Freud said in one of the most masterly understatements of the 20th century, in his end of his Future of an Illusion, he said, while mankind has made continual advances in its control over nature and may be expected to make still greater ones, it is not possible to establish with certainty that a similar advance has been made in the management of human affairs. No kidding, Ziggy. And the IMF has, warned us against all these geopolitical risks. And so, if we were to return to Bob Gordon's headwinds, the most serious headwind that I'm scared of, ladies and gentlemen, is not the national debt. It is not the aging of the population, as Gordon contends. It's this. Against stupidity, the gods themselves contend in vain. Friedrich Schiller. Thank you very much.
Wow. Thank you so much for that. And this brings us to our next speaker, Philippe Aghion, who was born in 1956 in Paris, France, did his PhD in 1987 in Harvard, United States. He's currently a professor at Collège de France and INSEAD in Paris, France, and at the London School of Economics and Political Science in the UK. Now, Philippe Aghion met Peter Howitt by chance at MIT in 1987, where they had neighboring offices. Creativity must have been present right at their first meeting, since they immediately started to work on a model with repeated patent races put into a macroeconomic framework. Their result pioneered the former study of innovation-driven growth through creative destruction. And their wonderful partnership is described by Peter Howitt in terms of complementarity, where the passionate Philippe Aghion, who started his career as a microtheorist, serves as the accelerator. Philippe Aghion, it will be a pleasure to listen to your talk. The stage is yours.
Thank you so much. It's in all respects intimidating to be presenting now in front of this, of course, very prestigious audience, and after my friend Joel, with whom I agree on everything, but says things 10 times better than I would ever. So that so it's in all respects a big challenge. I would like to thank the Nobel Committee. It's been a blessing to be awarded this prize. And when I learned that I was sharing with Peter and with Joel, it was heaven to the square, because I could not imagine sharing it with people I'm more attached to, and you know, it was very fantastic that I share this prize with them. It was like awarding me twice. The other thing I want to say is that I would like to extend my thanks not only to the Nobel Committee, but to all my students and co-authors, and several of them are there, and several of my students became my co-author, are now renowned growth economists, and they are now the frontier. They are the new frontier. It's exactly the approach we push. The new generation, becomes the new frontier, and this prize is their prize. And I'll try to pay tribute to all my friends here as much as I can within 30 minutes. I just wanted to say something about so how this started. In my Schumpeter, in my students here was a curiosity. I mean, in an IO class with Richard Caves, you would hear about Schumpeter en passant, quoi. Or in a history of economic thought class, you would say, well, there is this guy Schumpeter, creative destruction, and that was a nice idea. The leading model in my youth was the solo neoclassical model, which is a very elegant model that tells you that you produce GDP output, final good, with stock of capital and labor, and that's the first equation. And the second equation tells you that you can increase the stock of capital over time by saving part of the output you produce and invest it in increasing your capital stock, and that's how you have the economy grow. But of course, Solow himself would make the reasonable assumptions of decreasing returns to capital accumulation, and from there you get that you could not explain long-run growth of per capita GDP without having something else that he would call technical progress. But Robert Solow will not tell you where technical progress is coming from. So that was the thing, but there is this guy, Schumpeter, and his idea of creative destruction. And there, so that's where it came, the thing. When I was a Harvard student, the thing with me is that I go very far, and the whole suspense is, will I fall off the cliff? Well, and certainly you have the flowers. I think it was for me when it was just put there to save my life. So the thing is that when I was a student at Harvard, my dream was to become to enter the Harvard Society of Fellows. It's a first-class postdoc. For 3 years you are paid like an assistant professor, and every Monday you have dinner with Amartya Sen, Bob Solow, leading physicists, and it's a very very prestigious thing. And so I was shortlisted to have an oral exam with them. And at dinner time, Solo, who was a senior fellow, was seated next to me at dinner. And he said, look, Philippe, you're a very nice guy, but you didn't quite understand the questions that were asked to you. So I realized that I had failed the test. And because I failed the Harvard Society of Fellows, well, I ended up at MIT, which is not the worst, fallback that can happen to you. And that's where I have my neighbor, who was Peter Howitt. And we would talk to each other. And it was in '87. Peter was visiting from Western Ontario for the year. And we started to talk to each other. And one day, I think I came to your office, Peter, and I said, why don't we try to, or we said together, why don't we try to write from scratch a model that would encompass Schumpeter's notion of creative destruction. And now I ask myself, my God, imagine that I had passed this bloody oral exam, at the Harvard Society of Fellows. I would not be here today. Obviously not. Of course, you never know the counterfactual, but I mean, I'm pretty sure that I will not be here today. So that's why failure, or seeming failure, because MIT is not the worst failure that can happen in your life. I mean, failure, or what you think is a failure in your life, can prove to be, your revival, your sauveur. Voilà. And that's voilà. I hope the joke is not part of my timing and I start the lecture. No, whatever. Okay. Okay. So, so here is a picture of young Schumpeter, who used to say he was good at 2 of 3 things, being a good lover, a good horse rider, and a good economist. And he said one of the 3 was not good. I won't go into this. And I won't tell you how Schumpeterian I am or not. Voilà. In that respect. Okay. So creative destruction is the process whereby new innovations displace old technologies. New innovations make old technologies obsolete. And as I told you, here is Peter. We will recognize him. And with Peter, we decided to write from scratch a growth model that would encompass 3 main ideas. And in fact, it intersects very much with what Joel talked about. The first idea is that long-run growth is driven by a cumulative process of innovation where each innovator builds upon previous innovations. The second idea is that innovations do not come from heaven. They result from entrepreneurial activities motivated by the prospects of innovation rents. When you innovate, you find, a better way to produce or new product, and that gives you rents for a while until you are superseded by subsequent innovations. And the third idea is creative destruction. New innovation displace old technologies, make them obsolete. And of course, what's interesting with this paradigm is that at the heart of the paradigm, there is a contradiction. On the one hand, you need monopoly rents, innovation rents, to motivate innovation activity. But on the other hand, yesterday's innovators are tempted to use their rents to prevent subsequent innovation because they don't want themselves to be subject to creative destruction. And regulating a market economy, it's a lot about how to manage this contradiction. And we will talk about secular stagnation, we will talk about middle income trap, whatever we talk about, you come across this contradiction that you have to manage. Okay, so that's the thing. You see, it's a lot, about all the time you have new talents, you have to let them grow, but of course you have to make sure that once they've grown, they will not prevent subsequent talents from coming and growing. And how you make that happen? Okay, so I will just argue it, since we were awarded for a model, I should show at least a few equations, because otherwise you feel I'm a complete crook. So really, in a nutshell, the Aghion-Howitt model goes, oops, alors no, that's not good. That's right. Alors, in a nutshell, what you have is that you have a finite good, which is produced with capital Y, produced with some intermediate input, which is small y, okay? And A that you have here is the quality of that means the productivity of the intermediate input currently used in the production of the final output, okay? The intermediate input itself, the small y, is produced with labor, and for simplicity, let's assume it's 1 for 1. 1 unit of labor gives 1 unit of intermediate inputs, therefore small y would denote both the amount of intermediate input, but also the amount of labor used in manufacturing the intermediate input. But labor has another, growth in this model comes from quality improving innovations. You see, if the previous state of the art intermediate input was of quality A, after a new innovation, you produce a new intermediate input of quality gamma A, where gamma is greater than 1. And gamma is the size of the innovation. And that's why the new is better than the old. And that's why the new displaces the old. That's the cube, you know, of the beautiful poster that we saw. Okay? So now, finally, I told you that you produce with labor intermediate input, but there is another use to labor, is to produce innovation. We assume a Poisson process, that's a bit like technical, but I will just say if you use Z units of labor currently in R&D, then a new innovation will arrive during the current unit of time at rate lambda Z, where lambda is the productivity of research. So you have two uses of labor, to produce small y, 1 for 1, and to produce innovation, okay? So now the model revolves around two equations, because we said Solow had two equations. We need two equations. If we have three, we fail, okay? So if you want to pass the parsimony test, two equations. The first equation is a labor market clearing equation stating that labor supply is fully absorbed between manufacturing labor small y and research labor small z. That's the labor market clearing. There is no unemployment here. Second equation, it's an arbitrage, it's a research arbitrage equation stating that in equilibrium, individuals are indifferent between either producing manufacturing and getting a wage, or working in R&D to produce a new innovation. And together, these two equations lead you to miraculously an equilibrium amount of R&D that will depend on all the parameters of the model. The productivity of research, the higher the productivity of research, the more R&D you will have in equilibrium. The higher the size of innovation, the higher the R&D in equilibrium. And once you have the Z, the growth rate is simply lambda Z, that's the frequency, times the log of the size. And the day we got this, I told Peter, we have it. Didn't I? This day, it looks very stupid, but I said, Peter, we are on to something. My God, this is a beauty. We decompose the Solow residual. We have what was there. So I'm always being very excited, and Peter has always been moderating me. I think I was jumping around. People were complaining at MIT because I was too French and too loud. Yeah. Okay, so that was, I think this has been, I think, the most exciting day in my life. Voilà, the lambda Z log of gamma. I said, whoa, God. Bon, okay. So what this tells you is that growth is positively correlated first with the turnover rate and with the quality of innovation gamma. And that tells you about US versus Europe. US has a higher rate of innovation than Europe, but you could also say that US has a higher rate of turnover. There is more job creation, job destruction in the US than in Europe. There is more firm creation and firm destruction in the US than Europe. That means that there is a higher lambda Z in US than in Europe. But in addition, US, they do breakthrough innovation, higher gamma. In Europe, we are incremental mid-tech. They are breakthrough high-tech. They have a higher gamma, and that's why US is growing faster than Europe. And the model directly speaks to that. Voilà. Okay, so let me entertain two main extensions of the model. Well, I'm here. So just some water. So the first extension is that what I call the step-by-step innovation. One counterfactual prediction of the Aghion-Howitt model is that when I have the Z there, the alpha, which is a measure of competition, a bigger competition would always give you less R&D, because innovation in the basic Aghion-Howitt model is always done by outsiders. They go from zero, if they don't innovate, to a value. And anything that would reduce this value, like more competition, would therefore reduce their incentive to innovate, and therefore would reduce the rate of growth. So the model had a counterfactual. Competition is bad for growth. But there had been work done by, John with Blondel or Nickel on microdata from UK in particular, saying that if you had any correlation between competition and productivity growth, it should be a positive one. You tend to have more productivity growth when you have more competition. So you had to reconcile that. And so, so let me just go there. So in fact, the thing is that what we did, why did we have this counterfactual? Because in our model, it's only outsiders that would innovate. It's always people from outside. Currently, Joel is the current innovator. I come from outside, I leapfrog Joel, I oust Joel, and I become the new producer. And I go from 0 to the value of the next innovation. And competition reduces that value and therefore reduces. But in fact, in practice, that's not the way it works. You have always in any sector of the economy, leaders and laggards. And it's not that the laggards leapfrog right away the leaders. They have to catch up step by step. And I need many steps to catch up with Joel before I can become a leader. So me, I will innovate to catch up with Joel. But Joel may want to innovate to increase the gap between him and I, to make it harder for me to catch up with him. Okay, I always have this, parabola. Okay, so let me drink more water. I get very dehydrated very quickly. You are a classroom. You are all equally good. Suppose there is a top of the class and the bottom of the class. And suppose I open the door, voila, exactly. And I let a very good element into the room. What will happen? The top of the class will work harder to remain the top of the class. But the bottom of the class, which is already discouraged, will be even more discouraged when I let this good element in. It's the same for firms. The blue line are firms that are close to the technological frontier in their sector. They react positively to more competition by innovating more and growing more. Those are the frontier firms. They innovate to escape competition. But those who are way below, which are the orange firms, they are already discouraged. When I let a good element into the room, they will be even more discouraged and they will do less. And so competition has very different effect on innovation by leaders and laggards. And if you look at the overall effect of competition on aggregate growth, it's an inverted U. And I'm sure that Peter will have things to say on the inverted U. But another thing which is also interesting, the more developed an economy is, the more blue firms you have compared to orange firms. So therefore, that tells you already that the more advanced an economy is, the more growth enhancing, on average, it is to have more competition. Okay? So that's the first extension of the basic model. The second one is firm dynamics. And that's really Clété, Kortum, Ufuk, Pete, and all, and you are all here, and we've done work with John and everybody. So here we can talk about firm growth. It's not about, not only we can accommodate heterogeneity that you have entrants and incumbents and leaders and laggards, we can talk about firm growth. And that was really the Clété, Kortum model did, and all what the model that followed. Here I represent a firm with 4 lines. So on each of these lines, that's how well the firm is doing. The A is the quality on each of the 4 activities of the firm. How can the firm grow? The firm grows by doing creative destruction on another line. So for example, suppose this other line goes right there, is current A. This firm will turn it into gamma A. It will drive out the current producer on that line, and the firm will become a 5-line firm. That's how you grow. You see, I have the ambassador in front of me. You are currently producing. I innovate upon you. I grow at your expense. But it could be that it's the opposite. On one of my lines, my ambassador does better than me and drives me out, and then I shrink. How do you enter in this model? You are nobody, and you innovate upon one of the lines. You become a 1-line firm. How you exit? You are a 1-line firm. Somebody innovates upon you, and you drive out. It's very, and we see what's nice is that with this model, you can account for several facts. First, of course, you have a lot of small firms but many few large firms, because to become large means to have survived a lot of threat of being, you know, shrunk, you see, by no entrance. So you have, that model will tell you right away that you have many small firms and very few large firms. Is exactly what we observe. Another prediction is that it will tell you that so the first, this graph is Ufuk and Aksigit-Kerr. This one is Pitt and Shank Dai-Sei. We tell you that if you have a relationship between age and size, should be an increasing relationship, because I start being a one-line firm. But then I may grow, not grow, but in expected terms, there is a positive correlation between age and size. Why is it steeper in the US? And US pre-Trump. I don't know now, okay? I will tell you about bad joke I did with Trump. Is because when you are a good innovator in the US, you get financing, you get venture capital, institutional investment, so you can grow more. And therefore, you can evict those who are not as good as you are. So those who remain and survive are also better. So not only is because you get more financing, but it's because of that, those who survive are intrinsically better. And that's why you have this tip. It's much less true in India or in France, you know. You run in law, you stop, okay, or whatever. But France is more like here. But and that's the second fact. And the other thing is that the exit rate is higher for firms or young firms than large firms. Why? Because when you are a one-line firm, it takes one creative destruction for you to be evicted. When you are a 2 or 3 size firm, it takes 2 or 3 creative destruction to be evicted. That's why the rate of exit is larger for young and small, and that's exactly what you observe. So you can see this model tells you firm dynamics, heterogeneity. You can really confront the model with microdata. And that's what became very exciting, is the dialogue between theory and empirics, the back and forth continuously between data and the model. And that's the exciting part of this adventure, okay? So how long do I have? 1 minute? 10? But minus the jokes. The jokes were 5 minutes. You count the jokes, huh? Yeah, let's make a deal. Now I get water, and I have more time. Yeah. Okay. So I would like now, what I would like to do, I think I have the wrong pointer, that doesn't help. What I would like to do now is to say, well, using the lens of this paradigm, we can do various things. In particular, we can try to elucidate historical enigma. And already one big enigma is the industrial takeoff. So I won't do, you know, what has been so fantastically done by Joel in his lecture. I will, and the other thing you can do is to rethink capitalism, okay, nothing less. So there are 2 enigmas I would like to talk about. One is secular stagnation, okay? And you see, so there are various papers that use a version of the Schumpeterian model, and those are the 2 papers I want to mention. So I will start by the joint work with Antonin Bergeau, Timo Boppard, Pete Clino, and Yui Lee, and then I will talk about Ufuk, Aksigit, and Sina Ates. So what you can see here is that if you look at the average yearly TFP growth rate in the US, it has soared up between 95 to 2005. And then it went down a lot. Okay, that's maybe part of the secular stagnation, you know, enigma. But what's interesting is that at the time where growth soared up, you had a big increase, an acceleration in increase in concentration. That's the work that John, who is here, has done with Autor, Katz, Dorn, and I remember whenever I have a co-author I don't know, the co-author raise the hand. Well, you see at the time of where you had the growth soaring up here, you also had an acceleration in concentration. It's true in services, but also in other sectors. And you can see that also in markups. You can see the average markup in the US economy going up, but not so much because within firms it went up. The blue curve is not upward sloping. It's the black curve. It's a effect. Those superstar firms, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, those firms were high markup firms. And through merger and acquisition and all kind of things, they became tentacular. And those were the high markup firms. And that's why the average markup went up. It's a composition effect, okay? And in fact, you see, what's interesting is that those are these large firms that had the increase in establishment, the rising establishments. Instead of being the small firm that increased most the number of establishments, it was these large firms that expanded the most. And that's why the red curve shows is the firm with more than 10,000 employees that expanded more than the other firms, okay? The problem with that is that it ended up discouraging new entry. You see what I mean? And that's the Schumpeterian conundrum. You had these large superstar firms. They harnessed the power of IT. Okay, they knew how to use IT better than others. They grew large. They initially pushed the growth process. But eventually, by becoming so tentacular, so pervasive, they ended up discouraging new entry. And that's why, because competition policy, and we go back exactly to what Joel was saying, is that the institutions here, in that case, competition policy, did not adapt to IT. We should have had a much more dynamic competition policy. That's what our friend Richard Gilbert from Berkeley and others argue. Okay, that's the problem we had. And in addition, if you move now to Aghion Attes, they look at the same secular stagnation phenomenon using the step-by-step innovation model, where you have laggards that need to catch up step-by-step with leaders. And what Ufuk argues with Sina is that, in fact, the leaders, by not sharing data or by doing other kind of things, they made it harder for followers to catch up with them. And therefore, they increase the gap between them and the followers, you see? And you can see here that the technological gap between leaders and followers, the distribution of gaps, you see, is moving to the right between 1980 and 2010. Increasingly, the gap between leaders and followers increasing a lot because they didn't share data. They didn't share knowledge. And the result of that is that, consequently, the leaders' rents have gone up because the production became more concentrated in the hands of the leaders, and that's what you have, the markup going up. And at the same time, entry of new firms or laggards innovation was discouraged, and that's why you have less entry. And you can see how the Schumpeterian framework and its extension can really tell you something about creative destruction and about the fact that you need the appropriate institutions to harness the power of technology. Okay, how long do I have? I'm almost done, almost done. 5? Oh my God, yeah, I want to talk about middle income trap. Some people say I'm anti-MIT and middle income trap is MIT, but not at all. I owe a lot to MIT. So we want to talk about the fact that some countries start growing and then they stop growing at some moment. So for example, if you look at the Soviet Union, that's Ufuk's graph, you see that Soviet Union is growing a lot, and at some moment they stop growing. And that's why they get the middle income trap. You see? And so that's very much based on work I did with Fabrizio Zilibotti and Darren Acemoglu. We say, well, you have two ways to generate productivity growth. Either you catch up with the technological frontier, or you innovate upon yourself. You grow from A to gamma A, where gamma is greater than 1, which is the size of innovation. And the policies that are good for catching up are not exactly the same as the ones that are good for growing frontier. China, for example, for 30 years has been growing by catching up. For catching up, they needed to absorb technology transfers from elsewhere, to have a good education policy, to open up and take advantage of technology transfers. Competition, for example, I told you, was much more important to grow at the frontier. You see, so the policies that are good for catching up are not the same. When you are about frontier, you need much more creative destruction. You need much more, liberalized market for products and labor. You need venture capital. You need institutional investor. You need Draghi. You need all what Draghi is talking about, okay? And so here is the case of Korea. And you see that Korea was growing very fast after the Korean War. After South Korea, I'm talking about. But then the growth rate went down. And North Korea, it's electrocardiogram et plat, as we say in French. Okay, flat electrocardiogram. So what happened in Korea is that during the catching up phase, you had the growth of conglomerates called the Showbiz. I don't know if there are Koreans among you, because I'm very bad at pronouncing Korean, you know. It's not my best thing. The Showbiz, not only did they discourage entry of non-Showbiz firms, but they put pressure on the Korean government to not move from policies that were good for imitation into policies that were good for frontier innovation. It took, in fact, the crisis of the late 90s to weaken a bit the power of the showballs, for more competition to happen and for growth to, you know, to pick up again a bit, okay? But now, you know, let's keep going. Because Japan is another, it's not a middle income, but it's still subject to the same syndrome. Japan grew up a lot through catching up between 1945 and the 1990s. But then they fell into the same thing, because in Japan, it's not the Chowball, they call them Keiretsus. The Keiretsus were big conglomerates that, again, not only, you know, discouraged non-Keiretsus firms from entering the market, but also, you know, didn't favor, were able to prevent the government from moving into more pro-competition policy. But you know, the worst of the worst is us, Europe. That's the worst to come. So I think that should not be counted at the time, because it's for Europe that I do that, and it's a big plea. I represent here Europe, EU area per capita GDP compared to US per capita GDP. And you see, of course, we had a big fall with the war, because in particular, a lot of capital was destroyed, okay? And you see, between 1945 and the mid-80s, we caught up. Europe caught up with the US in terms of per capita GDP. But since the mid-late 80s, again, we are losing in terms of per capita GDP to the US. And that's the problem. And again, it's the thing, we were good at catching up, because first, thanks to the Marshall Plan, we rebuilt our capital stock. Also because we had a good education level, we could catch up with the technological revolution that had occurred in the US in the 1920s. That was catching up growth. But now the problem is that we have to do frontier innovation. As I told you, we are stuck in Europe into mid-tech incremental, and they do high-tech breakthrough in the US, okay? So if you look, for example, and this should really worry you, if you look at particularly at the right-hand side, and you look at you know, the high-tech patents, the US is in red, China is in blue. So when I went to China, I said, here you are. So everybody was, woo, woo, woo. Okay, great. Voila. But Europe, we are in green. You see the thing? We need to wake up. We need to wake up. And we need the Draghi. What Draghi says, we need a truly single market for goods and services. We need to have, you know, a proper financial ecosystem of innovation with venture capital and institutional investors. In that respect, Sweden is ahead of everybody with respect to, because a fraction of your tax, as far as I know, is used to feed pension funds. That's what's in the Draghi report. Tell me if I am wrong there. But you found a way to develop institutional investors, but we are well behind the rest of Europe. And we need DARPA. We don't have the equivalent of the Defense Advanced Project Agency, which is a pro-competition way to do industrial policy. Well, I remember a discussion with Anders Borg. Whenever I would pronounce the word industrial policy, we said, whoa, I believe in competition, therefore never. That's a bad word. If I have said, you know, whatever, I don't say anything. So, and now people are warming up to the idea the US is doing it, China is doing it. They try to reconcile competition policy and industrial policy. We need to do it in Europe, because otherwise, you know, we are declining. Okay, and that's the front page of the World Development Report that Ufuk and Germith built. Was very much, you know, the did on middle income trap and creative destruction. And this middle income trap is, I think, is a very, you know, powerful idea. So let me end up with rethinking capitalism, and then I'm done. Okay. So, US does poorly on inequality and social protection. I mean, I don't want to be sick in the US, unless I'm wealthy, okay? And, but Europe does poorly on innovation. If you look, for example, I'm stopped. Is it cool? Where am I here? Now it's good. Yeah. If you look at Gini index, which is a global measure of inequality, you see that it's higher in the US than in Germany, France, and the Scandinavian countries. If you look at poverty rate, it's higher in the US, France, and than the Scandinavian countries. There is the death of despair of Anne Case and Angus Deaton. If you look at the death rate of unskilled middle-aged in the US, it has gone up a lot because people get stressed. They fear to lose their job because they lose entitlement to health services. They take opioids, sleeping pills, they eat too much pizza, they die, okay? And I love pizza, but be careful, don't overconsume, okay? Okay, so, so that's the US socially. Now, when it comes to innovation, there, of course, the picture is very, rosy for the US. If you look, for example, at the flow of triadic patents per million inhabitants, patents, which are registered in the US Patent Office, Japanese Patent Office, and European Patent Office, so there's a good patent. You see, the US is above everybody, you see. And so what you would like to have, and again, I'm doing the same mistake there, and I'm done, huh? You would like to combine the good side of the American model, innovation, with the good side of the European model, protection and inclusiveness. Some people believe it's an either or. If you choose to be more innovative, it has to be at the expense of inclusiveness and protection. If you choose to be more inclusive and protective, it has to be at the expense of innovation. And I believe there are at least three policies I want to advocate. Flex security, education and competition that can make you both more innovative and more inclusive. You can get on both, you can win. Let me just say very briefly why. Alexandra Roulet, who is here, she looked at the labor market in Denmark, and she compared the evolution of the health of a worker in a firm that closes down to the evolution of the health of a similar worker in age, education, experience in a firm that does not close down. No effect of losing your job in Denmark compared to the control group on purchase of antidepressants, anti-anxiety, sleeping pills. No effect. And again, I do the same mistake because I press always the wrong. No effect on the probability to have a heart attack, and no effect on mortality. They found this flex security system. It's a way to make creative destruction work better and to protect. What is it? In Denmark, when you lose your job for 2 years, you get a very high fraction of your salary. The state retrains you and helps you find a new job. I believe in this system. I think we should all emulate. I think Sweden, you're maybe close to it. France, we are very far from it. And I advocate flex security. Particularly with AI, there will be job creation and job destruction. You need flex security to make people accept socially the AI revolution. So that makes it will boost the innovativeness because it will make creative destruction work better, and it will also not be at the expense of protection. The second thing is education. Here I'm looking at the probability of inventing as a function of the parental income. And you see you have this J curve. You are much more likely, the left-hand side is US on current data, the work by Bell, Chetty, Jaravel, Petkova, and Van Reenen, and John, Xavier and John are here. The second paper is by Ufuk, John Grigsby, and Nicolas, there should be an A there. That's the same on historical data US. And this is joint work that we did with Ufuk, Haitinen, and Toivanen on Finnish data. And you see that you are much more likely to innovate if your parents are in the high income bracket. We were very surprised about Finland, because in Finland they have a very good education system that I would like France to emulate, and it's free from kindergarten to PhD. So how come they have this J curve? And we tried to elucidate this enigma, and we saw that in fact the higher earning parents in Finland are also more educated parents. So they give knowledge and aspirations to their children. So when you control for education, the curves become the red curve much flatter. But still, it doesn't completely solve the enigma, because if the school is so good, why should parents make such a difference? But in fact, the reform in Finland, they had a big reform in 1970. It's in 1970 that they made the school system comprehensive. The big problem is the lost Marie Curie, as Xavier calls it, or the lost Einsteins. We have many smart kids born to poor families. The parents cannot give them the knowledge and aspirations to become inventors. And if you improve the schooling system, you will make more innovators and more inclusiveness. And that's what they did in Finland. You can see that we compare here the probability of inventing of a child in Finland that goes to school after the reform of 1970 versus you know, those who went to school before. And you see that the reform of 1970 lifted a lot, you see, the probability of inventing for children whose parental income was in that zone. So really, the reform of 1970 in Finland increased the number of lost, reduced the number of lost Einsteins. It made the economy more innovative and more inclusive. I'm done. Competition is the last one. I told you that you had a big problem in the US, but with this decline in productivity growth, and it had to do a lot with the superstar firms discouraging entry. If you reform competition policy in the US, you make it harder to do merger and acquisition. You look at the effect it would have on future innovation, future entry, and you force sharing data, you reform competition policy, you will have more innovation because new entrants will be able to come and innovate, but also we know that entrant innovation is good for social mobility. That's work we've done with Blondel, Axigit, Bergeau, and Hemus, and Ufuk and David are here. And we showed that there is clearly, why is it that more entry in entrant innovation? Because creative destruction is a source of social mobility. Creative destruction is about the new replacing the old. It's a fantastic source of mobility. If you liberate, if you reform competition policy, you will make your economy more innovative because more new talents can come in and innovate, but also entrant innovation boosts, through creative destruction, social mobility. And so at the end, creative destruction can deliver sustained and inclusive growth and prosperity, provided appropriate policies are put in place. AI has considerable growth and employment creation potential, but again, appropriate policies and institutions need to be put in place. Thank you very much.
So much. It was fantastic. Thank you. Thank you so much, Philippe Aghion. I think we're all warmed up now and ready to take on the final talk by Peter Howitt. So Peter Howitt, he was born in 1946 in Toronto in Canada. He got his PhD from 1973 at Northwestern University in the United States. He's currently a professor at Brown University in the United States. And Peter Howitt, he's the other half of the dynamic duo that created the theory of sustained growth through creative destruction. In terms of complementarity, he is the macroeconomist who brought the general equilibrium perspective into their model. He is widely regarded by his colleagues as kind, supportive, and wise, and is affectionately described by Philippe Aghion as his best friend. Please come up to the stage, Peter Howitt.
Thank you. Okay. Right, thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you very much. I would also like to begin by thanking the Royal Swedish Academy of Science and the Nobel Economics Committee for this amazing honor. It is, of course, the dream of a lifetime to be standing here, and I will be eternally grateful. I'd also like to thank my whole family for being so supportive of my work over the years, and especially my wife, Pat. Part of her support, of course, is supporting me, but it goes way beyond that. She and Philippe teamed up to keep me working on growth theory long after I would have continued. I arrived at MIT that fateful year, and Philippe was disappointed to have arrived there. I was quite happy to arrive there, but I wasn't looking to work on growth theory. I was going to be doing some search theory and some theory of unemployment and something totally different. So it's just by chance that I got there. But I've always been the sort of economist that likes to just follow their nose. When something interests me, I start wandering away from whatever it was I used to be doing. And when I started talking with Philippe, I thought, well, that sounds pretty interesting. So I started wandering away from growth theory, from unemployment theory and search theory. And it was a tremendous collaboration. We knew at first that right away that we had something big on our hands, and we kept working on it. But over the years, as the years passed, I started finding other things that I got interested in too, and I started spending less time working with Philippe and more time doing other things. But whenever that would happen, Pat would get these phone calls from Philippe saying, Pat, tell Peter that what he's trying to do now isn't nearly as important as what he was doing. You know, he's like someone who thinks he's good at writing poetry, and that's what he wants to do, but what he's really good at is writing detective novels, and that's what he does with me, so bring him back. So, and Pat was smart enough to realize that, yes, Philippe is right, and so it's as much because of her as it is Philippe that I continued to do what I'm sure is the best work of my life. And thank you, both of you. A lot of what I'm going to be saying today is now familiar to you because you've heard a lot of it from Philippe. But I hope you don't mind a little bit of repetition, perhaps in a quieter voice. I don't know. It might help. When we began our work on innovation-based growth theory through creative destruction, it was almost 40 years ago now. And the state of the art in growth theory was, of course, embodied in the solo model that Philippe described. And there was nothing wrong with that model, except that it was seriously incomplete. You could use it to show how, because of diminishing returns, the economic growth could not be sustained without technological progress, continued technological progress. And in fact, you could show that in the long run, the rate of economic growth would actually equal the rate of technological progress appropriately defined. But it took the rate of technological progress as given, as something that was just not affected by anything going on in the economic system or anything motivated by economic objectives. And moreover, it was assumed that the technological progress sort of fell like manna from heaven on everyone below and benefited everyone more or less equally. All wages would go up at the same rate as a result of technological progress, and all businesses would become more productive at that rate. And of course, we know that neither of those is true. Technological progress comes to a large extent from innovations made by profit-seeking business firms. Businesses innovate in order to earn what we would call monopoly rents. They innovate in order to be able to produce goods that their rivals can't match. They innovate in order to produce goods at a lower cost than their rivals can do. And in both of those cases, what they're able to do is to charge prices above the cost of production and earn a supernormal profit without being profitably undercut by their rivals. So this is very much an economic motivation. And we also know, of course, that the gains don't fall uniformly on everyone. There are losses as well as gains. And that comes straight from the process that we talked about, the innovation process that I just described. Those who succeed in making innovations and being able to outdo their opponents gain profits. They hire workers to produce. Their workers get higher wages. But those who fail to innovate get displaced. They lose business. They lose profits. People who worked for them lose. And in general, that's, of course, Schumpeter's process of creative destruction. And that creative destruction is something that is shared by anyone whose economic fortunes are tied to technologies that are rendered obsolete by the new technologies that are driving economic growth. And creative destruction generates a conflict that's really at the heart of the growth process. The conflict between old technology, those who gain from the new technologies, and those who lose because their fortunes are tied to older technologies. It's at the heart of the growth process because whether or not and how fast a country can grow will depend very much on how that conflict is resolved. Will those who gain from this creative destruction succeed and be allowed to implement their new technologies and so on? Or will those who would potentially lose manage to block the new innovations? You know, there are a lot of things that influence that process. Now, you might wonder why it is that these ideas of Schumpeter, of creative destruction, that were enunciated in his 1942 book on capitalism, socialism, and democracy, still hadn't been incorporated into the mainstream of economic growth theory in 1987 when Philippe and I met. And it's a good question. I think there are a number of aspects to it, but I think that the main reason is that this process of competitive innovation and creative destruction involves some fairly complicated strategic conditions that had to be worked out in order to create a coherent mathematical model. And you imagine a market where some product is being produced and everyone knows that it's capable of being improved, not just once or twice, but any number of times. Someone might undertake to create the next generation of that product and earn some monopoly rents from it. But there'll be other people racing to do the same thing. And so how much you spend on hiring people to do research, to try to speed up the arrival of this new invention, to get it for yourself, will depend to some extent on how much other firms are racing to get to the same goal. The faster they race, the faster you might want to race. Or if they're very good, you might give up. It's a strategic situation where how much you're investing in it depends upon how much others are investing. How much they're investing will depend upon how much you are investing. And to figure out what's going to happen, you need to find some kind of a Nash equilibrium or something, where everyone's doing what they find most profitable given what the others are doing. And to make it more complicated, they've got to realize that if they succeed, if one firm succeeds in discovering generation X of the product, there are going to be other firms striving to come up with generation X plus 1 that will displace generation X. And the more you expect them to be spending on innovation, the faster they're going to do it, the shorter will be the duration of your profits that you'll get from having invented generation X, and the less the payoff will be to you. And so you have to take that into account. And you have to sort of put yourself in their position to figure out, well, they're going to be doing something like what we're doing, but that means that they have to consider what will be happening to people trying to come up with generation X plus 2, and so on and so forth. So it's a bit of a tricky situation. It's not impossible. It requires the use of some game theory. And back in those days, game theory was making tremendous advances, but largely in microeconomics. It was slow to come to macroeconomics. It was coming into some discussions of monetary policy and fiscal policy, but not into growth theory. Well, fortunately, where we met at MIT was also the home then to Jean Tirole, who was a master at using game theory in industrial organization theory. And he was, at the time, just putting the finishing touches on his magnificent book called The Theory of Industrial Organization, which had a whole chapter devoted to patent races, the sort of thing that we were talking about, but trying to put it into a macroeconomic model, which was a somewhat more difficult thing because there are just so many more moving parts in a general equilibrium system than in the system of an individual market. So what we did was we managed to, by studying these theories, we managed to find a way to model this this process of this, how this strategic situation would work out, and we managed to put it together into a macroeconomic model, a model that could then be used to go out to look at real-world data to see how big is this effect that affects economic growth, how big is that effect, what are the other things that could affect the incentive to innovate and so on, and would affect the rate of economic growth. So I'll just show you a little bit of what that model looks like. Philippe has already gone over it with you, but this is just my own little version of it, if I can actually come up with it. No, I guess not. Just oh, I have the wrong clicker. All right, okay. There we are. There are two key variables here. One of them is the frequency of innovations. Actually, my notation, we didn't coordinate enough here. My notation's a little different than Philippe's. This is the overall frequency of innovations in the whole economy. And this is something that in our model is the result of firms trying to maximize their expected values, taking into account the strategic situation that I've just described, knowing that in order to innovate faster, they would have to hire more research workers. Those research workers had to be paid a wage that depended upon what they could also get in manufacturing industries. The model determined what that equilibrium wage was. It determined what the rate of profit you could expect as long as you had a monopoly would be. And firms would solve this strategic problem and come up with a frequency of innovations for the whole economy. And the other important model was the size of innovations, gamma. And it was, in some versions of our model, just taken as given, and others it was subject to the same sorts of considerations as lambda. And the only equation I'm going to show you is a very simple one here, which is that the rate of economic growth in the long run in this model was just the product of lambda, the frequency of innovations, and the log of gamma, which is a measure of the size of innovations. And there's nothing really surprising about this equation. It's really just saying that, if you like, the faster, if you want to run faster, which is what's on the left-hand side, you've either got to take longer strides or take them more often, and that's what it is. It was a simple model, but it provided a template that we could use to relax various simplifying assumptions, introduce new real-world complications, to address a whole variety of issues. And over the years, we managed to use it to address how economic growth affects and is affected by, in turn, international trade, competition policy, education, the environment, population health, political economy, government fiscal policy, economic inequality, the patent system, and a lot of other things that many of which Philippe has already talked about. So I'd like to talk about a couple of those areas of application. The first one being competition policy. Schumpeter's view, when he wrote about creative destruction, was that because it's monopoly rents that motivate innovations, we should really be very gentle with antitrust policy. We should leave monopolies alone, let them enjoy their rents until someone replaces them, because the bigger the rents, the greater the incentive to innovate and capture some of those rents, and therefore the more growth the more innovation would take place, and the more growth would take place. And when we, in our very first model that we put together, that seemed to be the case. The higher the, Philippe showed a little parameter up there that measured the extent of, that alpha that measured the extent of competition. The higher that was, the faster the growth rate would be. But as we started elaborating on the model, taking into account this step-by-step nature, the fact that the further away a leader in an industry could get technologically above the followers, the harder it would be for those followers to catch up. And the more competitive the situation, the better able a rival who might even be a little bit behind was able to capture some of your profits to compete against you effectively and diminish your profits, the more the incentive would be to try to escape competition by innovating even further, by increasing your lead. And when we modified the model to take that into account, we discovered, lo and behold, that when you took a look overall at at how these two countervailing forces worked out, it implied that depending on the other parameters of the model, you would either get a monotonically increasing relationship between the degree of competition and the equilibrium rate of growth, or you'd get this inverted U that Philippe talked about, where if you have very low levels of competition, raising competition would, through this escape competition, give you more growth. But at some point, as you approach such a high amount of competition that there were hardly any monopoly profits left, the Schumpeterian effect would start to come into effect. But as I say, under some circumstances, that Schumpeterian effect never dominated. And and before long, we teamed up with the team from UCL, wrote a paper with Nick Bloom and Richard Blundell and Rachel Griffith, using this marvelous data set that they'd put together with basically every publicly listed firm in the United Kingdom over a period of many years, with a lot of variables in there. And what we discovered there was that indeed, in the UK data, the relationship between, we looked at the degree of competition within each industry, and we found that indeed, looking across industries, at first, as you raised competition, you got more innovation, more patenting activity, more productivity growth from those firms. But eventually, it tailed off. So there was this inverted U-shaped relationship. And they also found that most of the firms in the sample were in industries on the upward sloping part of this relationship. So that overall, for economic growth, it was clear that more competition would stimulate growth. So the reason I like to talk about this particular application of our model is that it just is an illustration of how taking these old ideas of Schumpeter and putting them into a mathematical model that allows you to go to the data and do some econometrics can really teach you something that even a genius like Schumpeter hadn't really fully appreciated, and in fact sort of stood Schumpeter on its head. And so that's one thing that we were able to do. This finding of an inverted U has been discovered in many other countries, by the way, and not just in UK data. And in countries where it hasn't been found, what people tend to find for the most part is that there's just this strictly positive relationship between competition and innovation. So I think that's something that I'm proudest of having started the theoretical literature on this. It's also true, of course, and Philippe has mentioned some of this, that there's a lot of evidence that that when you allow monopoly power to grow unchecked, that firms that have this power use it not just to continue innovating, but to try to suppress innovations by people that might make them the victims of creative destruction. There's evidence that firms have, in the industries that have become increasingly dominated in recent years by these superstar firms that have lots of funds at their disposal, that they have used such techniques as creating patent thickets, buying up patents from everywhere, so that anybody that tried to challenge them, their leadership, with a new technology would have to have the money to pay for all the legal expenses of defending themselves against suits of patent violation. They've engaged in preemptive mergers. When a rival gets to the point where it seems to be threatening the core business of one of these large companies, the best strategy often is not to try to compete against them, but to buy them out. You buy them out, and you can either direct their technological development in directions that are going to be complementary with the trajectory that you're on, or you could even just suppress the innovations. You don't have to worry about them anymore. And that's going on an awful lot. And of course, you can use your monopoly powers to influence politicians. The more politicians are swayed by contributions and various other favors, the more you're going to get policies that are in your favor. And you can also use it to help capture the regulatory authorities and move things in your direction, and to win public opinion in support of your efforts to suppress. They're not put that way, but in order to favor your continuing progress. And there is a lot of evidence, and Philippe talked about it quite a bit, that the fairly sluggish growth that's been experienced in many countries for the last 20 years, a lot of it can be attributed to this increase in unchecked monopoly power. So the other area that I'd like to talk about is patent policy. This closely related to that. It's clear that patent policies are important for a lot of innovations. If you can't appropriate the rents, if your invention can be copied immediately by anybody else, there's no profitability from having come up with it. It's also important that patent policies have, in most countries, have full disclosure laws. In order to get a patent for something, you've got to provide a clear and unambiguous description of what it is and make it publicly available, and that allows other people to build on those inventions. But as I said before, patent laws can be used also to block laggards and patent. So it's important to have a finite length to patents, and it's especially important because firms can get into this very unlevel situation where you've got a leader that dominates and the laggards are far behind. And in that situation, that's where the least incentive is to innovate. The laggards are discouraged from catching up because they're so far behind, and the leaders don't really have to worry about escaping competition. The competition is too far behind. And so breaking those up can lead to the kind of explosion of creative activity that you got, for example, when the 70-year-old monopoly of the AT&T Corporation was broken up in the mid-90s, and that led to this huge flurry of competitive, innovative activity in the telecommunications industry in the US. International commerce is another area where I think we've made a lot of had a lot of effect. And basically, what we know about the effect of international trade on innovation and growth is what we know from competition. Opening up to international trade is opening up to competition. And I think that's probably all I'll say about that right now. I just want to say one word about generative artificial intelligence, something that everybody thinks about when they hear about creative destruction nowadays, and they think about the possibility. Like any general purpose technology that we've observed, there is tremendous possibility for both the replacement of skills and for also the enhancement of skills and the opening up of new skills. But like any general purpose technology, it's going to take a long time and require a lot of downstream innovations to be realized. For generations, some of the best economists in the world have expressed deep concerns about technological unemployment, going back from David Ricardo through John Maynard Keynes, even up to Paul Samuelson. So far, history has shown that these predictions of high unemployment and low wages haven't been true. Wage income has tended to grow in proportion to national income as we've progressed. I do worry a little bit about AI. Generative AI has the potential to displace a significant number of jobs because it automates not only the routine, repetitive tasks, but also complex cognitive work that was once thought to require uniquely human judgment. As models become capable of producing high-quality text, images, software code, and analytical outputs, entire segments of knowledge-based occupations, from customer support to administrative roles to journalism, marketing, and parts of the legal and financial system, face the substantial risk of restructuring or outright redundancy. You've probably guessed, because Joel's already done that. That was written by ChatGPT, not by me. Okay? I thought it was, I didn't change a word. I asked it to write a paragraph on the job-destroying potential of generative artificial intelligence. I think it's pretty good for a first draft, written in about 5 seconds by a 3-year-old who's growing up very rapidly into something that, well, we don't know. And so the future is worrisome. We don't have a lot of historical evidence about these really disruptive, revolutionary general-purpose technologies. People that count the Kondratiev cycles or techno-economic paradigm shifts, different scholars call them different things, will claim that, well, there have been about 5 of them, and this is the 6th one. Well, that's just too small a sample to know what's going on. So we have, I tend to believe that the lessons of economic history will persist, even though I know that we're dealing with a very small sample, and we're dealing with something that looks unique in many ways, but only time will tell. So far, so good. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you so much. You stay on the stage. We're all the laureates come to the stage. Thank you so much, Peter Howitt. Now let's welcome all the laureates for 2025 Year's Prize in Economic Sciences. Peter Howitt, Philippe Aghion, Mokyr,